Okay, well with that, I'd like to introduce today's guest. As I said, she is both an architect and an engineer. She's also a faculty member in the School of Architecture here at Northeastern. Michelle Laboy is a senior designer at the award-winning firm of Marianne Thompson Architects. She has a master's degree in architecture and urban planning from the University of Michigan, where she received the A Medal and Thesis Award, and a BS in civil engineering from the University of Puerto Rico, where she received the Etienne Toti Award for academic achievement, and her research in environmental engineering and transportation planning earned national publication and research fellowships. Her research interests lie at the intersection of sustainable architecture and urban landscape, studying the evolution and cultural significance of the ecologically restorative project, building systems actively engaged in sustainable ecosystems, and the spaces that actively engage humans with the natural environment. A licensed engineer and active practitioner in architecture, she worked in San Juan, Detroit, Chicago, Barcelona, and now Boston, including working at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, managing the plan for Chicago 2016. Her experience ranges from transportation and urban design to high-rise building envelopes, sustainable schools, and houses. As an associate at Marianne Thompson Architects in Cambridge, a practice dedicated to architecture that is sustainable, site-driven, and deeply connected to the landscape, Michelle worked on many award-winning projects and currently manages the early education project for a major East Coast university. She co-founded Field Workshop to do design research exploring sustainable building systems and ecologies. Please join me in welcoming Michelle Laboy.
Thank you for inviting me, George, and all of you for being here. I'm delighted to be presenting my research and my work. I'll start with this quote from Juliet Kinchen that says, "The need to foster the young child's innate capacity for divergent thinking, the ability to come up with multiple answers, brings us back to the earlier 20th century pioneers of the kindergarten movement and the concept of open-ended play as a strategy for learning and design innovation, an idea echoed in the mantra of musician and cultural commentator Pat Kane, who said, 'Play will be to the 21st century what work has been to the industrial age, our dominant way of thinking, doing, and creating value.'" This quote and the image that you see on the screen of these two children in Glasgow is from the book on the exhibit called Century of the Child, Growing by Design, from 1900 to 2000, which was held in 2012 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, also called MoMA. The exhibit made the case that the 20th century was defined by a profound transformation of the way we thought about and designed for children, from toys to furniture to playgrounds, architecture, and even cities. In the context of developments of pedagogy, science, and art, and in response to significant historical events, including the two world wars, the Great Depression, space exploration, and globalization. The curator of the exhibit and the now director of the Architecture and Design Department at MoMA is suggesting that the idea of creative play was significant not only to the development of early childhood education, but to our contemporary design culture, even into adulthood. Think Google, if you haven't heard of their headquarters, open, informal spaces designed to foster creativity and innovation. Or think the increasing use of the term gaming through simulations like in computers that are essentially games that try to model complex urban climatological conditions and human reactions to them as a means to design many things, from communication strategies to emergency plans to the development of cities. This was the first installation you saw when you arrived at that exhibit in MoMA. The chair on the right is called the Trip Trap, was designed by Peter Opsevich after watching his own son struggle for a place at the dinner table because he was too small for an adult chair, too large for a high chair. And this oversized model, which was built in 1972, was actually part of their design process, and it was intended to help the design and fabrication team empathize with an average 3-year-old. At MoMA, people got to climb on these chairs and to understand the meaning of empathy and the value of designing for children. Understanding the scale of the child is, of course, one of the obvious considerations in designing for children, but there's many other considerations which are no less important. So I will give you a brief historical background of many of these themes and then present the work of our office in designing spaces for young children. It helps to first understand the historical and cultural context of these themes at the start of the 20th century, when we had barely even started to pass laws against child labor. This followed the Industrial Revolution, which, as you know, meant increasing migration to cities, pollution, crowded cities, and disease. At the time, a new focus on the idea of childhood was quite new. Giving children the opportunity to grow healthy and happy was just beginning to become part of the cultural discourse. Froebel, who pioneered the idea of the kindergarten, as a time for creative play, invented these toys that you see on the right and many other instruments he called gifts, which were considered age-appropriate and changed as the child grew, and developmentally correct. This awareness of how children learn at different ages was quite new for its time. Few thought about these differences before, and after his revolutionary introduction of the kindergarten, around 1910, Dr. Maria Montessori, who founded the Casa dei Bambini in Rome, wrote her revolutionary book on the Montessori method, which emphasized individuality, self-direction, freedom of movement and access to nature, music, and sensorial experiences as essential to the correct development of children's mental and gross motor skills. Her method spread around the world and became the guiding principle of many countries' school systems, including in the US. They inspired generations of design experiments as well that attempted to unleash the creative potential and imagination of children through design of a child's environment. Their influence was such that many historians have found similarities between the ideas of Montessori and the pedagogical principles of the Bauhaus, which was the famous design school in Germany, which was credited with really transforming in the 1920s the fields of modern industrial design and architecture. One of these designers in the Bauhaus was Marcel Breuer, here sitting quite handsomely in his very famous and now very expensive Wassily chair, who was one of the first to design modern furniture, which was lightweight and easy to clean for children. This image on the left is one of those pieces from a catalog of the time. In this other photograph, which became quite famous in exhibitions about contemporary design, which was taken in 1931 in Turku in Finland, by Aino Aalto, who was the wife of the famous architect Alvar Aalto. The couple's children are in the photograph in their apartment playing with Marcel Breuer's Wassily chairs, which they themselves turned sideways to pretend they were in a train. The chairs in front were designed by the Aaltos themselves. And this photograph, which was part of many publications and very intentionally staged, was credited with creating a new image in the 1930s of the modern family, a new focus on design and on modern childhood. Aino Aalto herself was very interested in Montessori ideas and even considered being a kindergarten teacher before going to architecture school. And she dedicated most of her professional efforts as part of the Alvar Aalto office to the design of kindergartens and children's furniture. The tables shown here were designed for her own children first, using wood, linoleum surfaces that were easy to clean, and rubber tubing edges to protect the children from hurting themselves. These were not things that people used to think about when they designed for children before. And these and other elements in this room, which was staged for an exhibit, were actually shown at the MoMA exhibit in 1938, which was the first exhibit showcasing their furniture and their ideas about modern living, but also one of the first to feature items for children. And it was shown again in many other international fairs in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, including in MoMA again. The Aaltos, along with some other important figures of the time, founded Artek, a company in Finland that was founded in 1935 and that continued to develop these and other models of furniture for children as well as for adults that made modern design not only iconic, but also modular, flexible, and accessible to everyone through mass production and very aggressive marketing, in fact. The advertisements of the company still to this day present this furniture as the image of contemporary, healthy, uncluttered childhood environments where, in the spirit of Montessori's ideas, children are empowered to configure their own space. You will find these in many of the most beautiful nursery schools actually in the world when you look through books. The 20th century also saw the fighting of disease, such as tuberculosis, as a design problem. Before antibiotics, daylight and fresh air were seen as the cure for the disease, and therefore the design of hospitals for people with tuberculosis aligned really well with modernism's ideas and emphasis on the open plan, the white walls, the abundant glazing, kind of simple interiors, and led the way to ideas presented in this exhibit. This is the poster of the exhibit from the Congress of International Modern Architects for the design of pavilion schools, designed to immerse the child in the landscape and provide maximum exposure to light and natural ventilation. Examples of these pavilion schools, like this open-air school for children with tuberculosis located in France, with classrooms that could be completely open to the outside, smooth, cleanable surfaces, in some cases rounded surfaces for ease of cleaning, for both walls and furniture, and abundant daylight started to show up around the world. These ideas about the benefits of open-air schools were soon expanded to the design of schools for healthy children. One of the most iconic was architect Jan Duker's open-air school for the healthy child in Amsterdam, which implemented these ideas in a denser urban site, obviously with verticality, by exploiting the opportunities provided by building technology with concrete cantilevers, radiant surfaces, and large panes of operable glass that opened all these multiple stories to fresh air and daylight even in the winter. With an increased emphasis on verticality in urbanism, Le Corbusier's proposal for the nursery school over the canonical Unité d'Habitation in France, which was essentially a constructed landscape on top of the roof of a multifamily housing building, was also revolutionary and developed some interesting images over the time that were quite important to architectural history. This fantastic landscape of ramps and pools and climbing walls on the roof of the tower provided views of the city in the distance, the mountains, and plenty of sunshine. And as the architect argued, the promise of a new form of modern habitation that liberated mothers from the oppressing housework. So the design of nursery schools was not only a pedagogical idea, it was part of a larger set of urban design ideas about family, society, modern living, the role of women, and even ecology. This was part of a larger idea that instead of a sprawling metropolis of identical houses, building dense towers in the park allowed the greening of the city between them. This was a recurrent theme, especially after the 2 world wars, when so many women had to join the labor force, and Europe had to focus so much of their energy to reconstruction of their cities, which had been destroyed by war. In that context is where Aalto's ideas for the industrialized city took place, with clusters of new residential communities separated but close to a major industry that would be built by mass production of prefabricated components and supported by and centered around communal services provided by the employer, including, of course, nursery schools, many of which Aalto designed herself. This and their design of children furniture were disseminated to large audiences of people in Finland and beyond. Aalto's ideas of communities around an industry were actually the capitalist adaptation of the socialist ideas of the collective housing that emerged in cities like Stockholm, Sweden, where again the residential building would have small minimum dwelling apartments and supported by communal services like a kitchen and a nursery school at the base of these multi-story buildings. These ideas were often championed by women designers, journalists and writers, and their male partners who were advocating for the liberation of women from the domestic role and accommodation of new models for the family nucleus. But of course, the misappropriations of some of these ideas did not always produce the intended results, and in our present world there are new challenges brought on by placelessness, as I call it, and the ecological crisis. So I transition here to present you our design work with a quote from the same exhibit about some of the challenges that emerged from these very transformational movements in the 20th century. She said, "We have been periodically reminded how the forces of modernity shape design and childhood in ways that are extraordinary and exhilarating, yet also complex and contradictory. As an embodiment of what might be, children help us mediate between the ideal and real. They propel our thoughts forward. Their protean nature encourages us to think in terms of design that is flexible, inclusive, and imaginative." In our work in Spaces for Children, we are very interested in the notion of place identity, which research shows is important to the development of children and their self-esteem. And the ambition of our project is to create spaces that are rooted in the landscape and integrated to local ecologies, to create sustainable buildings that are didactic, and to create rich spatial experiences that engage children with their environment. Ways to do that is to ensure that buildings are oriented to the path of the sun, which is important for the child to develop a sense of the rhythms of natural systems. They don't understand this first on, as well as time and a sense of self through play with light and shadow. To design buildings with physical attributes that promote natural ventilation, which is also important to improve air quality. Our contemporary interior environments are full of toxics, by the way, but also to improve alertness, increase the understanding of the seasons, and reduce energy consumption. Unfortunately, natural ventilation is rare in many schools in the United States. And of course, heightening the sense of place through the direct engagement with the building and the landscape in ways that are unique to its place and its region. The use of locally sourced and natural materials is also a way to create a connection to a place, but also of improving air quality, sequester carbon, and reduce the embodied energy of the building. And of course, using native plants as part of the learning environment, create a connection of the child to the regional landscape and ecology, and it happens to be better for the environment too, because it is requiring less irrigation, less fertilizers, etc. And although we didn't ultimately cure tuberculosis with sunshine, there is a great body of evidence, some of which I'll show you here, of how designing an integration with local ecologies and climate is beneficial to the development of the child, including how daylight improves learning and student performance. It also works for adults, by the way. In Europe, it's actually law to have access to daylight from every space. Unfortunately, too many schools in the United States have classrooms without any access to daylight. An interesting study also showed that having access to morning light specifically is especially important for young children to maintain their circadian rhythms. So basically the necessary onset of melatonin in the body to want to go to sleep at night, which in other words means that when they get access to natural light in the morning, they sleep better at night and therefore perform better the next day. There are studies that show also that having a view of green or some sort of natural setting enhances cognitive abilities. It also provides stimulus for involuntary attention, in other words, spacing out, which is actually quite important to have a few times of the day to perform better and sort of give your mind a little break. Views of the landscape and access to natural play also reduce stress in children. Scientifically. Of course, this is an interesting design challenge for urban schools and one that can be quite generative in the design process. One last piece of research, and there's so much out there that I'm not really going to show you today. Doctors have discovered the importance of indoor air quality in the health of children. Children are, in fact, far more susceptible to toxins in the air than adults, and that's obvious because their body size would have more concentration going through less developed metabolic channels, greater disruptions in development, but also because they have more future years of life ahead of them to trigger chronic disease. So designing buildings with materials and techniques that improve air quality is very important in the design of spaces for children. So I will show you quickly 3 projects of buildings for early childhood education, one that was completed and one in which you can say was seminal work to our practice, and that led to the 2 other projects that are currently on the boards, one of which is my main project right now. And so the one that you see here is the Children's School in Stamford, Connecticut, which was completed in 2007. It is a Montessori school for 120 children, ages 2 through 8. They wanted one large room, no classrooms for individual age groups, to give the child maximum freedom. We, of course, didn't want a Walmart of a school because it's a fairly large school. So these diagrams show you how sort of the main formal concept, which was to transform the large required volume by shifting the different activity areas along structural lines. And that forms a kind of variegated edge on the building and not only embeds those edges into the landscape, but also define learning spaces outside of the building that are sort of nooks along the edge of the building. The plan is oriented south, as I mentioned before, to follow the path of the sun. And the programming of the activities in the building actually follow the programming of the building related to the sun. So younger children who are there only in the morning are mostly on spaces on the east where they get more morning light. And the older children are on the west side of the building primarily, so they take advantage of the sun throughout the entire day. The entrance is on the north, so the idea is that the sequence is to enter from the north and the spaces open out completely to the natural landscape and play areas on the south. This is the building as you see it from above, which shows you how, in order to define these spaces, we also folded the roof, and you can say we shifted it one against the other, from one direction to the other, to create clear stories between those volumes that provide opportunities for daylight to come in between those volumes and penetrate deep into the space. And here you see another image of those variegated edges, all the different volumes, and the folded roof. The building has large overhangs that create covered active play and learning spaces at every building edge, because children are free to come and go from inside to outside all day, as is sort of mandated in Montessori philosophy. And here are some sections cut from north to south that shows you how the roof slope shifts direction as you go through the building. So on the left, you can see the little key plants showing where that section is cut. They're all cut in the same direction. And you can see how we create these pop-ups on the roof that allow for daylight to enter in, especially as the building gets deeper. Here's another long cross-section in the east-west axis that best illustrates how it is still one large open space, but how the structure defines individual areas within the open space. The idea was to create what we call a dispersal of space, as illustrated in this conceptual perspective, that encourages the child to be an active learner and the building to be an active object to be discovered. The diagram above explains how the plan does that through diagonal views and multiple thresholds that create a layered reading of space. And here you see the quality of those interior spaces and how you see the thresholds from one space to the next and the amazing abundance of natural light coming from all sides. You can see the clear story. It's basically the gap between two roofs, allowing that light to come in from all sides, which is more of the condition you experience when you're outside. The use of south-facing glass predominantly, also having louvers to control glare and solar heat gain, which create very interesting conditions that feel like being outside, like dappled light under a tree. The material of the ceiling, the wood soffit, carries from outside to inside to reinforce and articulate that connection of the outside space and the inside space. And here are a few more images of those clear stories. And then the section, a little larger, as I explained, we used overhangs to also block the summer sun and let the lower winter sun in, which then helps heat the concrete slab on grade, which essentially acts as a thermal mass. And that's particularly important because children mostly play and learn on the floor. Within this large open space, there's many opportunities to create intimacy when the ceilings come low and in the intersection of these shifting volumes, such as the library you see on the left, where it creates little nooks where children can also choose to be alone if they want to. And then there's a lot of attention that we pay to the detailing of the building edge to create a thickened threshold between inside and outside, and mediate and engage with natural systems. For example, a gap in between the building and that canopy let the rain come through and sort of become a presence in the interior space, and the wood louvers that filter the light, etc. This project in Connecticut has led our office to some significant commissions in childcare centers. This first one is on a corporate campus, a large corporation that, not unlike what Alto was projecting, wants to build a daycare center for their employees to be only steps away from their children. An effort many companies are doing now to retain and support new parents who are very also important to the company. The challenge of this center, if you can gather from the images, is its scale. It's intended to be for 200 children, very young children. And so the question was how to integrate this massive building into a very large corporate campus while still maintaining a more intimate scale and a sense of place for smaller groups of children. So we helped them identify a site, and the strategy was to place the building kind of on, you see it here, on the edge of the campus, but along a main axis of one of these groups of buildings. And then to break the scale of that volume, as you see in the diagrams to the right, to essentially create groups, age groups, and the building creates these fingers that extend out into the landscape and let the landscape filter in between. Along that central spine is where all the circulation of the building is, connecting all of these spaces. And you see in this image how you get these moments where the building gets very narrow and you get these amazing views of the landscape. We're working with often Michael van Valkenburg landscape architects who are quite good at what they do. I refer to them as MVVA. And they're really fantastic collaborators that have helped us integrate the building and the landscape. Part of that strategy is also using the slope topography to terrace the building to meet the natural landscape and create a constructed interior landscape of ramps that are actually quite exciting and make for a very dynamic interior space. This is the other project we're currently working on. This is also a daycare center for a major research university in the East Coast, and very similar in scale, in fact, about 200 children. This university has also made it a priority to provide these types of facilities to their faculty to support them during the early years of becoming parents. This project is on the very eastern edge of the campus, right on the border between large institutional buildings and athletic fields and the residential neighborhood where many of the faculty live. It is also right where MVVA, who's also the landscape architect for the university, has identified ecological corridors, which are essentially sort of fingers of landscape and woodland that should be restored to essentially the original ecology through landscape-based stormwater strategies, which essentially means using landscape instead of gray infrastructure to treat water. And also where woodland would be brought in along from the lake to connect the neighborhoods through these sort of nature corridors to the lake. This gave us the perfect site to negotiate between an urban condition and a constructed landscape condition. So we oriented the building to the sun path, which is shown in this diagram, placing it along the northern edge of the site, of the block, to create an urban edge, but then opening it to the playgrounds on the south, which is essentially is a good way of extending the seasons that children can play outside. We also studied wind patterns to ensure that the entrance was sheltered from cold winds, to create spaces to gather outside the building that even in winter were comfortable to be in. But also MVVA, and the image on the far top right is looking at how the building and the topography and the plants can help block the wind to make the outdoor learning environment comfortable during the winter. The plan places all of the children except the infants along the south edge of the building to maximize the exposure to daylight and thermal comfort and to open to the playgrounds. It creates a diagonal view, which you can see through here, from the entry, which is over here, to the common space, through the common spaces and into the landscape. All the circulation spaces are filled with light and views of those landscapes. And the corridors are also widening at points to create small and large gathering areas that activate those corridors. So we don't have that institutional feeling of a bunch of doors in a very boring corridor, which is essentially, that includes a large atelier space, which is in the spirit of the Reggio Emilia pedagogy, and a large multi-purpose room, which is acting almost as a pavilion that sticks out into the landscape. That gives a space to run and play on bad weather days, and it still feels like you're outside. The sustainable strategies are very much part of the learning environment as well. It is a passive solar building, which means that it's primarily oriented to the south to be heated and cooled that way, with large overhangs on the southern edge that block the summer sun and let the winter sun in, but that also create covered spaces to play along the edge of the building. We super insulated all the walls. That's a term used when you use more insulation than code requires, and essentially limited the glazing to about 40%, and minimized it along the north wall, which is where it's cold. That's why also you see so many of the utility spaces along the north. And then maximizing the glass coverage on the southern side, where the sun is, in the northern hemisphere at least. We ensured that the facade strategy provided sufficient operable windows, not only on both sides of the building, but also top and bottom. And the water from the roofs, especially the sloped roofs, are visibly carried through a scupper that comes down and splashes on a big rock in the playgrounds, but that's also carried through rain gardens to be treated along the perimeter of the site. In the sections, you can see the strategy to break the scale of the volume through multiple level roofs and to bring daylight in with all these clear stories that you see here. And that also helps with heat stack ventilation. In children's spaces, you also have to design the interior environment. It's not just the shell. You have to really understand the furniture, the built-ins. And the idea is that the development of the classrooms gives the child a sense of freedom, many opportunities for activities, but also maintains sightlines so that teachers, no matter where they are in the room, can see all the children at the same time. The landscape is also designed by MVVA with age-appropriate areas directly connected to each classroom and following principles from the Natural Play Initiative, where basically we don't have a lot of plastic playgrounds, but mostly using natural elements to create opportunities for play. There's a lot of research that shows that kids get quite bored with plastic structures quite fast. They conquer them too fast and then they don't want to play with them anymore. And here are some preliminary renderings for the entry under the storage canopy, the lobby where you can see the atelier space along the ramp and get views of the landscape beyond. Here through the lobby into the multipurpose room and through the landscape. And of course, you can see the use of natural materials, daylight and light colors, and the distant views to the landscape, which are intended to heighten a sense of place. And then looking back from the playground, back at the building where you can kind of make out the pavilion of the multipurpose room. So I will leave you with just some thoughts about design that I think summarize the principles that guide our work. One, design is a dialogue. It engages with many aspects of cultural production, from literature and art to science, technology, pedagogy, and ecology. Two, that architecture is aspirational. It shapes the experiential and performative qualities of landscapes and organizes new ways of dwelling, working, growing, learning, and even playing. Construction is transformative. It engages building systems with complex social and natural ecosystems that extend far beyond the immediate site where the building is. And what I would call ecological synthesis is to design spaces that build meaningful relationships with natural, social, and cultural systems in ways that are uplifting, didactic, sustainable, and inclusive to form a dialogue between architecture and landscape where essentially one constructs the other. Thank you.
All right, well, we're I think, 5 speakers in, and we have architecture. This is good. I thought it was a great presentation, and I think the business about really understanding your user is fascinating, both from a kind of child development standpoint, that the tracing that history, and then how much its designers have been involved for a long time in this enterprise. So what I'm going to try to do is focus on some issues of, you've shown us, let's say, what and why, but I want to ask some questions about how you guys work, because this audience probably doesn't know what I know very well, which is your firm has been doing just spectacularly good work for probably 20 years.
Yeah.
And but it's interesting that you guys have migrated into this slice of the market, because it's not one I would have necessarily guessed 10 years ago. And as you said, when users are children, it isn't just about making adult things smaller, or that's the way I would rephrase what you said. But I wonder if you could try to help us think about the process that you go through, and first of all, trying to empathize with the children, and then I want to talk about the many other, it's not actually, even if it's a child development center or a daycare center, they aren't the only constituents by any means. No. But let's first talk about how you guys get answers to your questions about what would be best for these kids.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we acknowledge that we're architects and not teachers. And although we prepare ourselves and try to read as much as we can about childhood development, the reality is that there's many people who do this every day, all the time. So we always rely on listening first. Typically, you have a user. In this case of the university, they don't have a business of taking care of children, but they hired an operator that has been doing this for many years. And so they know all the ins and outs of how things need to work. And we spend a lot of time listening. And in fact, this project, we probably spent 6 months in what we call programming phase, which is really understanding how big should the group sizes be, how we distribute them, what are the main elements each group needs, what are the ratios of teacher to children, et cetera. And we really try to understand the needs of that group, of each age group too. And we reach out to other consultants even outside of those, because interestingly enough, many of these people who have a lot of years of experience working in schools, they haven't been working in the best environments with the best buildings, so they don't even know exactly what's wrong with their own building, or maybe they sense it, but they don't know how to fix it. So getting to that answer of exactly what would you do better about your space, or how can we really inspire or match these, align with their pedagogical models, is a difficult question. So we do a lot of case studies and study best practices from other architects. We visit a lot of other buildings, and we figure out what's working, what's not working, and talking to other centers, other schools. Over the years, you start to develop a really good understanding of what works in different environments.
It seems to me that, in a way, I love this as a project type, because, on the one hand, gosh, it's a pretty hard thing to be against, right?
Yep.
Having a good environment for children to be raised in. But when you tease it apart a little bit, it's probably different than, let's say, a school system building a new kindergarten. Because in this case, the real problem to be solved, I'm going to speculate, and you tell me if I'm right about it, is the reason this is happening is a university wants to do everything it can to retain excellent faculty who happen to be of the age that they'll have small children, and where their dedication to their own little offspring is so great that they might be willing to go somewhere else if they thought that their kids would develop better in that setting. So the client, in a way, are the faculty, or the young faculty of this university. Those are the people who have to be ecstatic about the outcome.
Yes.
Now there are a lot of other clients, in a way, or maybe you want to talk a little bit about the difference between clients and users in a complex network like this.
This is particularly interesting in this project, and you're absolutely right. Our client is the university. It's a university building. They will own it, they will maintain it, and for them, they have certain criteria that they apply to all of their buildings, whether they're doing a lab or an auditorium like this or a childcare center. And those are the people we deal with on a day-to-day basis and who criticize our drawings and give us feedback. But then we have the user let's say the operator. The user ultimately is the child, but the operator is basically the group of people who will administer the building, who are really the child care experts.
Including teachers, or is it mostly administrators?
Administrators, teachers, all different kind of staff, program coordinators. There's all these different professionals that get involved in this project, and they all will have different requirements for their office space or their consultation room. And then there's this third group who are really the people that the building is being designed for, as you said, the faculty who want their children to have a very special experience growing up and to be well taken care of. And they have very high expectations of what this building can be. They're very committed to issues of sustainability. They want their children to be quite exposed to that. And so they have those demands. And of course, they maybe are a voice that comes through us mostly through the university, but they're very much a presence in the project. And not only as, let's say, consumers of this service, but also in many ways as someone to take care of as well, because many parents, especially young parents, go through a great deal of difficulty the first few years, and they have to also be, let's say, hosted in this building. There's spaces for parents to give advice to each other, to be consulted. You have to make room in this space for the child who's going to be crying for an hour, or the parent who cannot let go those first few weeks. So those are very interesting dynamics that we have to consider. We have to be very empathetic to. And we try our best to get that information. We did a questionnaire that was sent to the users of the current childcare center to get their feedback on how they envision this. And that questionnaire went to the teachers, it went to the parents, and it went to staff, and to the university. And we get very different answers from all of those.
Well, a large part of our audience today is engineers. By no means all, but we have a lot of engineers in this class. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, we can talk more about this. First of all, that you have a background both in architecture and in engineering. But also, that kind of gives you a particularly clear view of how architects and engineers make decisions in situations like the one you just described, which is what difficult and complex problems are all about. That is, they have more than one set of criteria against which you must optimize. Do you know what I mean? If you're designing a bridge and the only variable is how do I use the least amount of steel to get a solution, well, I don't want to say there's only one answer, but it's a very narrow set of answers, right? Or if you want to do the one that is super strong in order to because you're going to have freight trains, double-stacked freight trains going over it. Those are, I don't want to say single variable problems, but pretty close to single variable problems. What you're describing is very different, and let's try to get into a little bit about how, like for example, the forces or the criteria that shape what the building looks like from the outside, with which the university might be particularly interested from a campus planning standpoint, and then what the rooms want to be like from the inside, which is governed by a complete, in this case especially, a completely different set of things, tiny scale, Freudable blocks, whatever. Maybe talk a bit about that decision-making process and how you sort all that out.
Yeah, so it's very true that these are complex problems and they never have a single solution, and which is why in our design process we always end up working in options, and you end up weighing all those options. So even though this looks like a very linear process of showing you all these decisions that were made, each one of those was one of 20 or 30 that were looked at and explored, and we sort of pro-con all the different options. We have a very excellent group of consultants that each have their own specialty, and so they are able to think more deeply about a particular issue and provide options, and then we see where the conflicts are with other priorities. And that process requires a lot of negotiation, a lot of discussion. In the case of the university, it's interesting because although they have a very thorough set of design standards that are intended for ease of maintenance and durability, et cetera, they don't have standards for childcare centers. So the scale of this building requires some adjustments to what they normally allow. So in a way, you also initiate the process of developing those standards with them and identifying where their standards don't fit quite well. Finishes and although college students and children could actually require certain similar sort of, protection requirements for classrooms and things like that, the reality is that small children have a whole other set of requirements. And so we study options, we provide options, and then they have these huge teams of technical groups that are essentially the maintenance crews and the people who go and have to fix the problems when they go wrong. And they come in and sit with us and look at our drawings and give us a critique of where they think this might be a problem or that. So it's a continuous negotiation.
Well, the thing that I think I find fascinating, and I think the students will find interesting, is you probably have to, what we would call ideate or prototype. You guys, I suspect, make several different small physical models of different scenarios so that you can talk with multiple consultants or multiple constituents about, we like this one better from a campus planning standpoint. It's almost the ideal solution from a view corridor, street edge making standpoint. However, from a sustainability standpoint, it's this different orientation and geometry. And then from a, pedagogical perspective, actually it's a different collection of, so I guess that's kind of where the rubber meets the road in a way in terms of designing things, where I appreciate very much the point about that everything is a constant negotiation. Yes, but then you're also, I think, trying to find ways in which a solution to one set of problems actually supports solutions to another set of problems.
Absolutely. It's interesting, the three examples you just gave were pretty much the three, let's say, options we narrowed down to when we were doing 20 different options for the form of the building. One was more rational and compact and economic and had less entrances and less security concerns and
fewer angles.
Exactly. Some groups in the university loved it, but it wasn't quite as well adapted to the landscape and the topography and the solar conditions. And then there was one that was perfect pedagogically. We were doing exactly what we thought the child would find most interesting, but was incredibly complex, and the university didn't want to go in that route. So a fourth option was developed, which was essentially a marriage of many of those ideas. And so this one has a leg that gets bent in, and this one has something that opens out, and you start to, negotiate those and find the solution that satisfies all these different criteria.
This is a way of working that I think architects, just by the nature of what we do, are particularly good at. In other words, and I think when you think about, okay, well, that's interesting, but I'm not an architecture student. What does that mean for me? Well, I think the answer is, at a very basic level, what I often ask students to do, and do myself, is if there's a problem that has a whole bunch of variables, like a whole bunch of different sets of criteria, I actually make lists of what all the excellent qualities in order to address the campus planning issue. What are literally, what are they? Just write them down. And then to address the sustainability issue, what are they? And so once you have those lists, first of all, you don't have to carry it all in your head. Second of all, you can find things that might be common to multiple lists, which will be the keys to finding a jumping off point.
Absolutely. That's actually quite right. In many ways, the way we work, there's a set of goals that we establish for the project, and different people have different interests or priorities. Maybe the order of those goals are different depending who you ask. But in the end, they're all there, and they're all collected, and they're all considered throughout the process. And we go back to those. Even after we're far into the development of the project, we often have to take a step back and rethink, where are we? And although I agree that architecture, architects are really good at that, and maybe it's not so obvious for engineers how that applies to their work. The reality is that even engineers, my brother's an engineer who actually works in engineering, and a lot of his work is in a similar way, having a list of goals and trying to work through that problem iteratively. The idea that you create a lot of options, that you have iterations and you test them and you go back to them. It's the same process, but with a different maybe set of criteria or different priorities. And even engineers who work with us, I would say, are quite well-versed, and the reason we work with the same engineers over and over again is because they've learned how to understand what's important to the architect, what's important to the client, and they learn how to think outside of their sort of typical solutions to give us options that are more empathetic to what we're trying to do, and they're fantastic. They are very much a part of those options as well.
Well, clearly, engineers design tons of things, most of our world. But it's my hope that that this class will help them to understand other ways of thinking as a designer that are, I guess I would say, less linear, because there is a lot of, by necessity, a lot of. So another concept that we haven't really talked about explicitly in here, but that is really, I think, important, is a simple one, but a powerful one, and that's reverse engineering. And in many ways, the idea of looking at something that you think is really brilliantly designed. Wow, how did they ever do that? I wouldn't know where to start. Well, work back from, try to reconstruct, if you can, what were the criteria to get, why do you think this is so great? This is where analysis and is a great learning tool, because, if you look at I think if folks go back, and if you go to the Mary Ann Thompson Architects website, you can look at probably a lot of these projects, and imagine, my gosh, sometimes people look at buildings designed by architects and they say, that is, I would never have thought of that in a million years, whether they like it or whether they don't like it. They would just say, I don't even understand how they got there. But actually, you can deconstruct or reverse engineer pretty much any decision that gets made. You might end up finding the fork in the road that you wouldn't have taken. But it's that methodological focus that I think is so important.
Diagramming, really learning to analyze complex ideas into simple sort of sets of principles is actually one of the things that really helps us in understanding our own ideas, our own work, right? Because so it helps to look back at other projects and other people's projects, other architects or designers' projects, to understand them that way. It gives you also tools to start thinking about your own projects and how you make decisions when you get to these forks, how you make them different. It's an important skill, and in many cases an acquired skill that comes with a lot of practice and exposure to these ideas.
You'll be interested to know that later on in this course, actually, the students are going to hear a great deal about experience mapping and experience design, which is essentially the same as the designing of buildings and objects, but writ onto experiences. And an assignment that they're going to do, which is so powerful, and it's a real skill to take away from this class, is making an experience map against more than one criterion. In other words, so you're not just mapping, do I like Disney World? You're mapping, what was the experience like from, let's say, a fatigue standpoint? What was it like from a brand identity standpoint? What was it like from a financial drain standpoint, just to pick three out of the air? But the idea that you build a lot of information that can then underpin design decisions.
That's an interesting point, because there's a lot of the sort of success of good analytical drawings and analytical design tools is the ability to isolate information one at a time. Because as you see in many of probably the work that you see in this class, there's a lot of things that go into a project and a lot of complexities, but when you can isolate one problem at a time, you can see that more clearly, and then you can layer it with other information that's isolated, and you have an ability to see that is heightened by the just way in which the diagram accomplishes that. So it's an interesting experiment to do that through experiential mapping, because you will see the same experience in very different ways.
And you realize how then companies or websites or airlines or things like this, how they actually make meaningful change. Like, you know what, we analyzed at Virgin Atlantic Airways, we analyzed from everything from deciding to go on a trip, to going online, to buying the ticket, to routing, finding the best route and so forth, to getting to the airport, to going through security, to et cetera. And I remember a few years ago when suddenly, this may not seem like a big deal, but Virgin Atlantic started saying, oh, we'll take you to the airport. In other words, there was a part of the process that they didn't control, and they wanted to brand your experience of going to the airport to get on their plane. I imagine this wasn't for the cheapest coach seat, but the idea that they would come in like a red Virgin Atlantic car to your door and already begin the experience of being on Virgin Atlantic Airlines, like probably the design of the back seat of this car was very intentional. You know,
maybe they'll give you peanuts too.
Yeah. And for a fee. But I mean, I thought that was brilliant, because it was clearly a link in that chain of experience that actually airlines didn't actually play any part in.
Yeah.
And they could if they wanted to. And it was the kind of thing you wouldn't ever think of unless you did an experience map.
Yeah. It's interesting that, there's examples in architecture of sort of this sort of idea of complete design or comprehensive design. I think Frank Lloyd Wright or even the Altos, everything had to be designed by the same group. And that sounds really controlling, but the reality is that everything is designed, no matter whether you design it or somebody else does. So if there's something that you think is going to work better, even if that wasn't part of your original scope, it's interesting to begin to think about how so many things in the environment support your idea, and you might as well start to think about how you might change that or make it part of. So that's part of why designing furniture, even though it's not the task of the architect, often is equally important. Right.
No, it's totally true. The period of the 20th century, especially, let's say the first half of it, where the complete work of art, architecture is a complete work of art, was interesting, a little bit monomaniacal in the sense that not much of the world actually was willing to say, we want you to design everything about our life, like let's say our value system, our clothes, our furniture, etc.
Yeah.
You know,
It can be taken to an extreme.
but as you say, the animus is very real, which is I'm going to try to control the whole experience because I have a vision for how it can be. And most of those architects, by the way, were very good because they were obsessed with the whole enterprise.
Very true.
Let me just ask you a little bit, you know the sort of keywords we've been using here about empathy and define and ideate and prototype and test. The prototyping, obviously in architecture and in these schools for little children or this daycare center is at one level very straightforward. You make some cardboard models when it's early stages, then later you make some that have more detail, but obviously I assume you split your time between digital models of the thing that are very easily analyzed, let's say for structural issues and other technical and systems issues, versus other kinds of models or images, and you showed some. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about how architects choose to represent their work so that it can be judged against different criteria.
Sure. There's certainly an important aspect of this, which is scale. In architecture, we work with building as a space that you inhabit and move through, but it's also an object in the city that has relationships to many things. And often the way to see that is to work at a scale where maybe the building is smaller and you're iterating maybe with less detail because you're interested in the kind of larger gestures at that point, and you're really trying to figure out form and scale and how it fits the neighborhood, how it's viewed from a street. So we tend to work in that stage very much in physical model.
Sort of from the general to the specific.
From the general to the specific. So we have a large model of the context with many, we make multiple options and we can place them there and everybody can see them and can start to relate to that sort of these formal ideas. It's also quite helpful for clients, not in this case because the university has their own architects, so they are quite adept at reading drawings and things like that, but often your clients don't know how to read drawings, but everybody can understand a model, so they can visualize three-dimensional space. And then we might move to a scale where we're only modeling a room, where now you're really looking at just a single room. And I always try to think of it as whatever you're designing, whether it's a whole city or the building or a room, it should kind of fit in your hands in front of your body, and it gives you a sense of it's sort of
You're talking about the scale of
the model,
of the model or the drawing that you're working on.
Right, correct. So, like for example, for classrooms, where we do have we design prototypes of the classroom. So we have 10 infant classrooms or whatever it is. We try to come up with what's the ideal classroom. So we're looking at the classroom in great level of detail. So in that case, you're working at a larger scale, and it also helps the teachers be able to visualize spaces that otherwise looking at interior elevations just seems quite confusing. But the three-dimensional digital model is actually increasingly the tool that we use, and this project is all in Revit, and we started modeling it in Rhino. There's different softwares have different abilities capacities to produce different kinds of drawings, and the ability to enter the building and move through it and make adjustments as you do that. It's something that you can't quite do with a physical model all the time, even though we do use them for these kind of general, larger gestural projects. So.
Let me ask you something else, because again, this will be very germane, I think, for the engineering students, and that is, at the intersection of digital work and the actual world, analog, if you want to call it that. I find, and I think we find in our school, that though digital modeling has brought unbelievable power and flexibility and changeability to everything we do, that you can iterate millions of versions of something. But exactly as you say, this issue about scale is an issue that causes, I think, oftentimes, at least, and maybe it's just because of my age, I like to see something printed out that I can mark up and understand the whole image with my eyes on the table.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean I won't edit it. It's just like printing out a paper and marking it up and then going back and editing it on the computer. I think there's something about how our brains understand stuff that the screen, which is fantastic, and we can see things that we could never see before.
Yeah.
So obviously it's super great. But there are times when you want to not have, in a way, so much flexibility. Let's just have that one view.
Yep.
Put that on the table. I know you can give me 7,000 views. I understand that. But let's just put that one view on the table, and we're going to articulate what is our objective with this view.
Yep.
Put that in a pile. And then we can take that pile of 15 suggestions that are in response to specific criteria. And then we can go back in and mess with the model. It's like updating your essay.
Correct. That is absolutely right. There's definitely something about the connection between the eye and the hand, when you can hold something, when you can see it, but there's also the question of intentionality. When you decide on a scale at which you're going to print your drawing, at which you're going to look at that, you have to make a decision about what's important for this particular discussion or question. And so everything else is similar to the idea of isolating information in a diagram. Everything else goes away. So there's a frame to the drawing,
a limit,
and a limit,
That's
right? What you're really focusing on, and a scale at which what you're looking at is important, and what you don't see because of the scale is not important. And that intention is what allows us to really focus. I sometimes call it, the squinting test. It's only what you see when you squint is in the end the sort of purpose of working in that way. And I agree, as much as we thought we were going to revolutionize the world with these digital tools, the reality is that they can be quite disorienting to a group of clients when you have to fly through the model and somebody wants to see something. It's like watching the Blair Witch Project. You're just like, and people find it disorienting, whereas they can relate to a physical object because they can control it, they can turn it around, they can see it. And I don't think it happens to everyone in these groups.
We should be clear that just to be clear about this distinction in scale. Imagine there's a digital plan drawing of the room we're in right now. We could look, if we wanted to count the number of seats, we would do it at a certain, and we were going to print it out at this size. We have to print it out at a size where you can discern each individual seat. That would be a critical criterion. If we wanted to count the number of boards that constitute this table, it would be a different scale, and it would be zooming in. So our drawing that's sitting on our table would cover only this much real estate as opposed to from behind the stage to the end of the room. And that stuff, see, on a computer you can zoom in and out seamlessly, but you're not necessarily landing at the scale of your intention, which is, I think, what you're getting at.
Correct. Yeah. And that's very important as a tool for everyone.
Exactly. It's not just, it's true really, it's the difference for a business student. It's the difference between an overall business plan, where does this idea land in the economy, and then a cash transactional strategy about how we get paid at the counter for it, for example. They're different scale of decision in the sort of thing from the general to the specific. We're going to switch to questions from the audience in just a second, but again, building a little bit on your dual bifurcated identity as an architect and an engineer, I wonder what part, this is probably an off-the-wall question, but what part of your engineering education has proved most significant in your career, even if it wasn't like the most intentional part of your education?
Sure. Well, I think being methodical is not something that every creative individual out there has. They can sort of not be able to sort of focus on a process. I think that's something that I definitely learned from engineering. I think more specifically in terms of my ability to do what I do now, are skills. Obviously, I think I can understand many complex things and try to sort of distill them to a simple set of, let's say, rules, and I can sort of manage those more adeptly, I guess. Questions of the environment and how things work, thermodynamics or structures and things like that, I think perhaps design education doesn't always include, or at least in architecture. So those are things that help me think about not just the environment and how it feels in its experience, but also how it works in many different capacities. So I have been told that I have, in the office, sort of people talk about certain sort of skills that I might have, which obviously includes structural, sort of how things come together. That's something that architects sometimes have a difficulty with, understanding how they assemble something, how something comes together, how forces might affect it, and those kinds of things. You definitely learn as an engineering student, and you learn to think about, and they're quite helpful.
No, I think we find oftentimes students who start in engineering and transfer to architecture end up actually oftentimes being especially good architecture students just because they have maybe the rigor from
rigor,
they have the passion to make the switch, but the rigor that they bring with them from one makes for a great team.
That's absolutely right.
My answer to somebody asked me that question once, which is why, in a different vein, because I have a slightly different background, but I said, strangely, at the undergraduate level, even though I was a very good architecture student, probably the most significant course I took as a freshman, and it was Economics 101, and it was such a good course, it just changed my life. And I don't know exactly, I can't be super specific about how it affects me today, other than it changed my perspective on the world in a way that was transformative.
Yeah, absolutely.
That and Chaucer. Nobody wants to take Chaucer anymore, but boy, it's good stuff. Do we have questions from the audience? Maybe do we have some on, we have a Twitter hashtag because we're extremely hip in this class.
Oh, wow.
They try to be very quiet about it. They don't like to
Anonymous.
brag about it. Yeah, but this is a very, very hip operation here.
Yeah.
So what are some problems that you encountered in the process of designing this school and nursery?
Some problems.
What was the worst? What has been the greatest? Like, I'm going to make the question slightly more dynamic. What was the biggest catastrophe to date?
Oh, wow.
The biggest, most profound misunderstanding between you and the client?
Sure. It's not necessarily catastrophic yet, but probably a problem architects encounter often. We were given a budget, and we quite rapidly blew right through that, and we ended up being told, you have to redesign this, and you have to still maintain the same program, same number of children, same expectations, but cut a quarter of your budget.
Right.
And that requires some very creative solutions. And that's where the engineering training also came in quite handy, to find efficiencies in space and economies here and there that, there was a lot of number crunching and figuring out how can we meet this and how can we meet that, and really massaging that to get to the point where we're back on budget. And that's happened twice already.
We still want the Lamborghini, but we don't want to pay more than $70,000.
And that's very often what happens in architecture, not just schools. This is very, very much part of the process. So that it probably produced the biggest changes to the project in ways that we actually ended up liking quite a lot. It was an interesting constraint that we knew but somehow had assumed, and this is happening a lot in the market nowadays. There's a lot of escalation in construction prices and things like that. So we had assumed some rules of thumb about price per square foot and things like that, and we quickly discovered that had things had changed
Right.
quickly. So we developed solutions that we ended up liking better.
Yeah.
And those kinds of problems actually become great opportunities for design, innovation, and solutions that work quite well.
Right, right. Good. Another? Great.
Do you know if there's been much research in imitating natural light? If so, is it promising?
In
Imitating natural light. Very interesting. So,
Oh,
in other words,
sure.
artificial light that.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a very clear example. Everybody's probably seen those lamps that help your plants grow in the winter, things like that. Not quite the quality of lighting that you like experientially, but there's definitely that.
Well, there's a very interesting example locally, and it's not brand new. This is not, let's say, a super recent innovation, but I'm thinking of your friend Alvar Aalto's dining hall at Baker Dormitory at MIT, which is really interesting. It's got a grid of skylights in the ceiling, but because of the understanding that this is New England and it's not going to be sunny all winter, it has outdoor lamps that shine down through the skylights with warm yellow incandescent light. I don't know what they use now, probably LED maybe. But that shoots through and gives the impression when you're inside that the sun is out, even though it's 7 o'clock on a December evening. So that's kind of interesting. But that's very intentionally trying to be like daylight.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the lighting technology, of course, is changing very rapidly, and LEDs, which are very low energy consuming, are often talked about as the issue that it's like white light or blue light or things like that don't quite match how we experience daylight, but they're getting better and better at coloration and things like that. But there's techniques that's sort of dealing with the technology. The other aspect of it is dealing with the sort of creating the conditions that feel like you have natural daylight when you don't, and often that has to do with mirrors placed in different locations which allow light to filter deep into spaces that would otherwise not have daylight, and sometimes it's reflecting just artificial light, but the light that has a certain quality.
That's a very powerful one. Because if you don't see the source, it's much easier to make you feel that it's natural light. So the great Mexican architect Luis Barragan was a master of painting a wall an incredibly bright or warm color and then shining indirect light onto it that made you think, oh my gosh, the sun is just right around the corner.
That's absolutely right. It's about creating an ambience or an experience. And I think a lot of daylighting design, or even lighting design in general, is about having enough good quality light from multiple directions, which is much more like natural light. Natural light never just comes from this one wall. When you're outside, light is around you and its direction is less important, which is better for contrast and things like that. It's very problematic to have a room that only has windows on one side because it creates a lot of contrast with other surfaces. So producing or helping that room with artificial light on other parts that provide a balance of light throughout the room is very important, or having windows when possible from both directions or even 3 directions if possible allows for that. Skylights are great, and obviously they can only be put on the top floor, so when you have multiple floors it's a problem, but they now have even these solar tubes essentially that they can run like a duct, and it can go quite deep, and you can get natural light down a few stories. And they're literally like a duct, and it's made out of mirrors inside, and so you might have a room that is down in a basement and maybe only has one little window up there, but it has this tube coming through that has daylight, because it's really difficult to produce the effects, the psychological effects of daylight. You can't accomplish that 100% with artificial light. So.
Okay, why don't we take one more?
How close do you interact with engineers in your projects? What role do they play in these designs?
Okay.
Like maybe the different disciplines, especially all the different disciplines, because it's more than they'll think.
Oh yeah, very closely. In fact, when I leave here, I have a call with one of them. I have a mechanical engineer. Well, we call them MEP. They are mechanical, electrical, plumbing. It's typically one firm that does all of that work. Mechanical being obviously HVAC and systems of heating and cooling. Electrical obviously deals with lighting and power, and then plumbing deals with all of the water going through the building, and fire protection as well, so sprinklers and things like that. We also have a structural engineer, and stormwater.
Geotechnical.
We have geotechnical is sort of comes in early in the project. They do studies, they do borings, they tell you the profile of the ground, and then for the most part they go away because they give you a list of instructions that the structural uses to design the foundations and the landscape architect uses for designing the soil profiles and stormwater. But they don't interact with us much more after that.
More like a surveyor.
More like a surveyor, yeah. We do have a civil engineer because, of course, these projects are, we need to do fire lanes and utilities because it's an undeveloped site and, parking and all these things. So we work very closely with them, and the landscape architect does. Mm-hmm. And we have very specialized consultants, like a stormwater management engineer, actually out of Boston. Very famous firm, Niche Engineering, who comes, I bring them to lecture in my class in the spring. Fantastic. They really know how to handle stormwaters in ways that are very creative, sustainable, and they understand that architects and landscape architects don't want to just put all the water down a pipe. So they really know how to understand landscape and plants and things like that, and how they handle stormwater and infiltration into the ground. Fantastic. And in other projects, we might have audiovisual consultants, people specialized in, all these systems in this room.
There's a growing, there's so many for systems and controls. If we look at architecture up until about, let's say, I'm going to say 1980. It was, the way it was done wasn't really that different from when Thomas Jefferson practiced. Yeah. Because the idea was the architect was the jack of all trades and knew enough about engineering to size his or her own beams, to figure out a lot of the technical issues associated with the project. Today, it's just completely different. It is the architect as choreographer of 10 or 12 or 15 different specialized disciplines, because we live in a much more specialized age, and that's the one you guys are going to work in for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. We might have, I was going to say, a few others that you might find interesting. There's firms that are specialized in things like energy modeling and daylight modeling and things like that, that we don't have the software to do, and we also don't have the time to do. And we have those kinds of consultants, and they're often engineers. They just went into that specialized area to help us with those kinds of things. And it's quite interesting and important to us to have them in our teams. So.
Well, I think with that, I want to thank Michelle Laboy very much, and thank you all.
Thank you for having me.